Please.
Okay, great. So it's great to be here. This is based on some joint work I did over the course of the last year with these fine people here. So Renee, Philip, Florian, and Harry. Renee and Philip are here this week. They're also on the job market and have many nice works represented in this conference. So you should go and chat with them. Okay, so what I'm going to be talking about is a new relationship between two previously unrelated fields, which are non-local quantum computation and information theoretic cryptography. Good. So I want to start out by just sort of skipping to the main technical subject or question, which is about replacing a local interaction with entanglement and a single simultaneous round of communication. Okay, so I've represented that here with this figure. On the left, we have two systems, A and B, which are coming together, interacting, let's say, according to the action of some channel N, and then splitting up again. And on the right, we'd like to reproduce that same interaction, but in a different form that involves never actually bringing the systems directly together. So instead, we're going to have A over here, say in Alice's lab, and B over there in Bob's lab. Alice and Bob are going to share entanglement. They're going to act locally on the systems they hold in their lab. And then they're going to exchange one round of communication. And then they're going to act locally again. And at the end of the day, the overall action on the AB systems should approximate the action of this channel. Okay. And the sort of thing we're interested in is, how can you do that? How much entanglement do you need? How much communication do you need? How complex are your local operations? And so on. So why might you be interested in this non-local quantum computation? Well, historically, this was first studied in the context of a cryptographic subject called position verification. I'm not going to get into any details about that today, but fortunately, Philip is going to cover it in the next talk. Okay. Another connection here and reason you might want to study NLQC is it turns out to be related to Hamiltonian simulation. So that's a new connection that has just emerged and is going to be covered in the talk after the next one from Harriet. A third reason you might study this is that it turns out to be related to a subject in quantum gravity known as the ADS-CFT correspondence. So that I am going to revisit a little bit later in this talk, and I'm going to use those ideas to sort of motivate some of what we're going to talk about today, some of the results for today. And then finally, a fourth connection, and the one we're focused on today, is between non-local computation and this really classical information theoretic cryptography. Okay, so many reasons you might want to understand this subject. Okay, so before I get to the new connections, I just want to give a little bit of context and background in terms of what we already know about NLQC. So as I mentioned, one of the main things you'd like to understand is if you're given some channel, you'd like to understand how much entanglement you need to implement it in this non-local form. Okay. There's a particular case of a non-local computation that we're going to focus on and has been sort of well studied for a number of reasons. And the special case is what's called F-routing. Okay, so here there's actually a promise on the inputs. The promise is that the input on the left is going to consist of an order 1 size quantum system that I'm calling Q, and then a classical string of length n that's called X. On the right, on Bob's side, we get a classical string of length n that we're calling Y. And then what you're supposed to do is bring the quantum system Q to the left or right, depending on the value of some pre-agreed upon function f. Okay, so if f of xy is 0, you should bring Q to the left, and if f of xy is 1, you should bring Q to the right. Okay. So this special case is interesting because it's sort of particularly advantageous in these position verification settings. It's also sort of a simplified setting where we can try and understand NLQC better. I'll give you 2 points that give you the sort of basic lay of the land in terms of what we already know about F-routing as of at least prior to this work. Okay, so the first comment is that for some functions, we know how to do this in non-local form efficiently, i.e. using a polynomial amount of entanglement. And as prior to this work, all of those functions which we could implement efficiently were a very low complexity. So in particular, they were inside the complexity class NC2, which remember is the functions that can be computed in log squared depth. Okay. A second basic point is sort of the complement of that one. So for all functions outside of NC2 prior to this work, we had at best exponential upper bounds. So we only had strategies that used 2 to the n EPR pairs to do this F-routing. Okay. Both of these points will receive sort of significant updates as a consequence of the new connections that I'll lay out today. And I'll tell you exactly what those updates are towards the end of the talk. Okay. So now let me get into, introduce a few details about information theoretic cryptography and start connecting it to non-local quantum computation. So information theoretic cryptography is a big subject. I'm not going to survey it or motivate the particular things I'm going to use. Instead, I just want to zoom in on 2 particular primitives that are studied in that field. They're well studied. They're useful in constructing various other cryptographic goals. But let me just say exactly what they are. So the 2 primitives are called CDS and PSM. Okay. CDS is short for conditional disclosure of secrets. It's a scenario that involves 3 parties, Alice, Bob, and a referee. Okay. Alice and Bob do not communicate, but they do share randomness, which is this R here. Alice gets an input string of length n, x. Bob gets an input string of length n, y. And then Alice also holds a secret, which is some short string s. Okay. Then what they're going to do is, from their inputs and their randomness, compute some sort of messages. And then they'd like to send messages to the referee such that the referee can determine the secret s if and only if some condition is met. Okay, so in particular, we'll think about some function f of xy. And when this is valued 1, the referee should be able to compute the secret. And otherwise, they should hold no information about the secret. Okay, so private simultaneous message passing is a similar primitive. The communication pattern is the same. Again, we have Alice, Bob, and the referee. Now there's no notion of a secret, however. Instead, what we'd like is for the referee to be able to compute f of xy, but otherwise learn nothing about the inputs x and y. Okay, so obviously the value of f says something about the inputs, but beyond that, we want the referee to not learn anything. Okay. Good. So both of these primitives have natural quantum analogs, right? I'll describe the quantum analog of CDS, and then the PSM one is sort of obvious from there. So in the quantum setting, we're going to let Alice and Bob share entanglement. There's still a secret, okay, which was previously a string and now is going to be some quantum system that I'm calling Q. And the goal here is the same. So we would like for the referee to be able to recover that system Q if and only if the value of this function is 1. Okay. This quantum version is sort of implied in a certain sense by the classical version. So if there's an efficient CDS protocol for a given function f, it implies the existence of a good quantum CDS for the same function. And that's basically just by a use of the one-time pad. So the CDS hides classical data, and we can use the one-time pad to hide quantum data using a hidden classical string. Okay. Good. So that's sort of what I wanted to say about information theoretic cryptography and some of the primitives that we might be interested in there. Now what I want to do is relate that to the subject of non-local quantum computation. Okay. So what we're going to show, first of all, is that this CDQS primitive is really equivalent to this F-routing subject, or their quantum, essentially they're the same thing. Okay. So I'll first of all show that a good F-routing protocol implies a good CDQS protocol. Okay. So to do that, I've started out here with a F-routing protocol in some general form, and from it, I'm going to build a CDQS. The way that I'm going to do that is I'm just going to take the systems that would have been sent to Alice in the second round, and I'm going to trace them out. I'll just throw them in the trash. Okay. And then the systems that would have gone to Bob in the second round, I'm now going to send to the referee. Okay. So it's a very simple transformation. I just erase this basically. Okay, so that defines my CDQS. And now what I need to show is that that's a good CDQS, that it's correct and it's secure. Okay, so this turns out to be quite easy. So let's first of all discuss correctness. Correctness of the CDQS means that when f of xy is 1, we want q to be recoverable by the referee, right? And if we look at the f routing, when f of xy is 1, q is recoverable on the right, and the systems sent to the right are exactly what was sent to the referee. And so correctness here implies correctness there. Okay. For security, it's similarly simple. So what we'd like to show is that when f of xy is 0, the referee can't learn anything about the system Q. And to see that, we just notice that when f of xy is 0, correctness here implies that Q ended up on the left. Okay, and basically by no cloning, since Q ended up on the left here, nothing about Q can be recoverable on the right, and hence the referee can't learn anything about Q. Okay, so it's pretty easy. Taking those two statements together, we get an implication like this, that a good F routing implies a good CDQS. I'm not going to show it for the sake of time, but the reverse is similarly easy. And as a consequence, you get that this F routing and CDQS are really equivalent tasks. Okay. So what have we learned so far? Well, we had this subject of non-local quantum computation with all these interesting connections. There's a special case called F routing. It turns out to be equivalent to this primitive CDQS, which is the quantum version of something studied in the information theoretic cryptography literature. Okay, so the connection is pretty easy to make, but something that's nice here is that this subject and this one have been studied independently and intensely for the last 20 or so years without the two communities realizing that they're really studying quantum and classical analogs of the same problem. Okay, and so what we can hope is that we're going to learn a lot from each other, and indeed that turns out to be the case, as we'll get to later. Before I do that, though, I want to introduce another connection between this other primitive, PSM, and NLQC, which I'll do now. Okay, the way I'm going to do that, relate that primitive to NLQC, is going to be to use this quantum gravity perspective that I mentioned earlier. The first thing I want to say about that is that using the quantum gravity perspective is not necessary. In the paper, we barely mention it, and we just give a direct quantum information theory proof relating this PSQM and NLQC. But I wanted to talk about it here because the strategy is interesting, and it also happens to be true that historically, or in the course of this project, that is how we found the connection. Okay, so we knew what we were trying to prove because of this gravity perspective, and then we just proved it using quantum information theory tools. Okay, so I'll have to say a little bit about ADS-CFT, so let me do that. So ADS-CFT is a statement that two apparently very different looking theories are really equivalent. The two theories, or one of the two theories, is a theory of gravity that lives in a special kind of space-time called a asymptotically ADS space. That's what I'm representing with this cylinder here. And then the other theory that's equivalent is just a quantum mechanical theory called the CFT that lives in the boundary of that spacetime. Okay. One of the things that we've learned about this ADS-CFT correspondence is that an interaction that happens locally in the bulk of your ADS space is reproduced in the dual boundary theory as one of these non-local quantum computations. Okay, so we have some systems here coming in, interacting directly. That would be represented with a circuit like this. That interaction, when I reproduce it in the CFT, you should think of as one of these non-local computation circuits like this. Okay. So we can use that perspective on NLQC to relate this PSM primitive to NLQC. Let's see how to do that. So I'm going to set up this PSM scenario in this ADS context. So we have Alice and Bob, who are sort of located somewhere near the boundary or in the boundary. And remember that in a PSM, what they're supposed to do is compute the value of this function, f of xy, and get that to the referee, but otherwise not let the referee learn anything about x and y, right? So how do they do that here? Well, what they can do is jump into the bulk of ADS. So they bring in x and y into the middle, they compute the function in the middle, they send the value of f out to the referee, and they send any other data, any other record of x and y off in some other direction, keeping it away from the ref. Okay. So that process clearly completes the PSM, right? The referee gets f, but nothing else. And then if we look at this in the boundary perspective, we know that this local interaction, because of what I was saying on the last slide, is happening as one of these non-local quantum computations. Okay, and so what that means is that there's some special case or class of NLQCs that implements PSM for you. Okay, so this PSQM, because there's quantum resources involved here, must be some sort of special case of NLQC. Okay. One of the things that we do in the paper is actually find which special case that is. And actually the ADS perspective also tells you which special case, but I won't explain why. We find which special case it is and then show this implication just using standard tools. So there's some special case that we call a coherent function evaluation, and it implies this PSQM. Okay. Good. So that starts fleshing out this set of connections that I showed earlier. So analogous to this sort of branch, we now have this one. So PSM implies PSQM. And then this coherent function evaluation implies PSQM. Okay. There's some other connections here that I haven't talked about. So it turns out that PSM is stronger than CDS. So there's an arrow there. And then the same is true at the quantum level. So PSQM implies CDQS. But okay, so now we have this big, set of relationships between these information theoretic cryptographic primitives on the one hand and NLQC. And we can ask, or what we can do is we can look through the literature on both sides and push the results through these connections and see if what we get when we push it through these arrows, is something new. And indeed, it turns out that works, and we get some new and quite interesting things about NLQC in particular by leveraging these classical results. Okay. So there's two of those that I want to talk about. There's others in the paper. The first one is this. So there's a result from 2017 that shows that for all functions, the cost of implementing a CDS, say in terms of the amount of randomness you need, is upper bounded by a sub-exponential function, in particular by 2 to the root n log n. Okay, so that means there's a efficient protocol, well, a 2 to the root n protocol for CDS. You get one for CDQS, and you get the same thing for F routing. And so at the end of the day, you get that all functions can be implemented as a F routing using this 2 to the root n sub-exponential entanglement. Okay, that came as quite a surprise because, as I mentioned previously, we needed an exponential number of EPR pairs. And I think if you asked me or any of my co-authors before this project, we would have guessed that there was also an exponential lower bound, and you really would have needed that. Good. Okay, a second result that we could leverage from the classical literature here comes from the theory of secret sharing. So I haven't explained this connection, but it turns out that somehow good secret sharing schemes also imply good conditional disclosure of secret schemes. And then in particular, there's this construction by Mel and Ishai that shows that, or they construct a secret sharing scheme that has some structure related to this function that is believed to be outside of P. So it's some function that's used in cryptography that's believed to be hard, at least classically hard. And they give an efficient construction for that scheme. Okay, and as a consequence of that, you get an efficient CDS for the same hard function, and eventually a efficient F routing for the same hard function. Okay. Again, that was quite surprising because previously we only had efficient constructions for functions of quite low complexity that were inside of NC2, and here we got an efficient construction for something of much higher complexity that was, not just outside of NC2, but even outside of P. Okay. Good. Okay, so that's pretty much everything I wanted to say. I'll just wrap up with a couple of final comments. So we connected these two areas, non-local quantum computation and information theoretic cryptography. by doing that and leveraging classical results, we get some significant updates to our understanding of non-local computation. So in particular, we got these sub-exponential protocols for arbitrary functions, and then we found the existence of this hard function that had an efficient F-routing scheme. A final comment here is that this raises a sort of interesting tension between these two areas in cryptography. So this was emphasized to me by Harry, who pointed out that so efficient CDS and PSM protocols are sort of good for cryptography. Okay, you want those to do things like secure multi-party computation and other goals efficiently. And then efficient CDS and PSM protocols imply good efficient NLQC protocols. And then that implies actually good attacks on position verification. So something I guess I didn't mention is that these NLQCs are attacks on position verification schemes. So this is sort of bad for cryptography. So sort of one of these things has to win out, and they're played off against each other. Okay, so that's everything I want to say. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. All right, questions? If you have questions, please come up by one of these mics.
Hi, thanks for the great talk. Actually I have two questions. The first one is, so for the 2 to square root n upper bound for all functions, do you know a better upper bound if f is, say, efficiently computable?
So we can give upper bounds. So there's an upper bound on the entanglement cost from the span program size of f. That would be the strongest thing that we know. And then there's an upper bound in terms of the size of a secret sharing scheme whose like indicator function, some aspect of its structure is determined by f. So those are.
So if there's like a small circuit for f, that doesn't necessarily mean.
Yeah, we can't give an upper bound in terms of circuits.
But do you expect that to be true, or?
It's an open question. So there's an intuition coming from the holographic side of the story that say anything even in BQP would have a efficient construction or an efficient like F-routing scheme. But so far the status is that basically we can do some things that are inside of this NC2. So a little more specifically, there's this class mod KL or mod PL. So it's like polynomial size span programs. Those we can do efficiently. And then there's this like one random function, which is quadratic residuosity. So some cryptographic function that we know is, or we think is outside of P, but we know is inside of BQP. That has an efficient scheme. And that's the status.
Interesting.
Yeah.
Cool. Yeah. Thanks.
You can also line up, so it helps with timing.
Efficiency. Yeah.
So thanks for the interesting talk. So I was wondering, I mean, your attacks now work for a special class of protocols for quantum position verification. I mean, would you expect that sort of this technique carries over to other ones, or is this connection to classical cryptography sort of special for this kind of F-routing protocols?
Yeah, like I guess partly you're asking, say I try and do an arbitrary unitary in non-local form, could that have a sub-exponential upper bound? I don't know. I mean, prior to this work, I would have definitely thought the lower bound was exponential. Now I think that's thrown into question because there's this broad class that has a sub-exponential. So I think it's kind of open. There is this work from David Perez Garcia, who shows that there are exponential lower bounds, but they're conditioned on some assumption about type constants in Banach space, and I don't have a good intuition for those assumptions. So yeah, maybe from that direction one can get an exponential lower bound, but yeah.
Thanks.
We have time for one more question. All right. If not, let's thank the speaker. Thank you so much.